Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It is my pleasure and honor to be here this afternoon with one of the most important people of the past 20 years.
That's right.
Susan Elizabeth Rice has devoted her entire adult life to public service. She was the 24th U.S. National Security Advisor from 2013 to 2017 under Barack Obama, President. And she was on the staff of the National Security Council, and she was Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. She was also U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from 2009 to 2013. But the thing that is very important to me is that she was the daughter of Emmett and Lois. And they were parents who raised her the way my grandparents raised me, and we're going to talk about that a little today. Because a lot of times when we talk to public officials, we go through all of the stuff that you've read in the newspaper, but what you really need to read is the stuff in her book, which is fantastic. She was an athlete, a student council president, valedictorian at National Cathedral School in Washington, D.C. So yes, she was very, very smart, and I'll tell you how smart. She was a Rhodes Scholar and attended Oxford. Hear those oohs? But she has spent almost all of that time as a public servant doing foreign policy, which is very hard and which is not that diverse. So I'm very excited that she has been a role model, she has been an ambassador, and she is someone that we can look up to. So some of our young people who are asking what they should do for public service, we should ask them to think more globally. So with that, I would like to bring up Susan Rice. Absolutely.
Thanks so much for coming.
So we are here to talk about Tough Love, my story of the things worth fighting for. And I can tell you one of the reasons I love this book is because it's written differently. This is not an obituary that goes in chronological order. She was born here, she did this, she did that. It takes a lot of the things, these one-in-a-lifetime experiences that you can only have as a national security advisor, and brings them into context. But before we start, I'm going to ask her to indulge me and read just a little bit from the bottom of page 2 to the first sentence on page 3.
So this is page 2, it's the prologue, and the context is I'm describing my last day in the White House, January 20th, 2017. Hey. So I'm describing my very last day in the White House under President Obama. This is January 20th, 2017. It's also obviously Inauguration Day. And I'm going into the West Wing to my office for the last time to finish up some paperwork, to clean up my remaining belongings, and to say goodbye to the handful of colleagues who are still there. My feelings are all jumbled up. I'm sad to leave, knowing that I'll mightily miss working with such good people and close friends every day. To a person, the senior staff of this White House, Obama's second-term team, are committed, kind, collegial, and selfless. It is them and my extraordinary National Security Council colleagues I will miss the most. For years, through all kinds of trials, we hung together in battle on behalf of what we believed was right for our country, on behalf of a president we respected and loved. I will miss seeing President Obama every day and receiving his customary smart-ass ribbings about my shoes, my short stature, or my tennis game, which he claims without any evidence and much to the contrary that he can best. Now, he can play some basketball, but I have seen no evidence he's got comparable tennis skills. I will miss the thrill and the import of serving my country at the highest levels and working on issues of utmost consequence. I can't imagine that anything hereafter will compare. Yet I'm also excited to be free.
Wow. Thank you. I was so moved by that particular passage and by that freedom that I wanted to start there, because you started the book in the prologue at the end, and that day driving into the White House, not being able to go all the way in the car and having to walk and hugging people. And I even got chills when you talked about having to do that transition and give things to Michael Flynn or anybody associated with Donald Trump. But I was moved about the freedom, and I want to talk a little bit about that. When you became the National Security Advisor, what did your parents say?
Well, at that point, my dad sadly had passed. My mom was still alive. And in fact, she lived until a few days before that moment I described in the book. She passed on January 4th, 2017. And I'm making a diversion here, but I really truly believe that after years of cancers and a stroke and pneumonia, even though she was physically very frail, she was mentally strong. And I believe she timed her departure to leave while her favorite president was still in office. I think my mom was very proud. And, you know, my transition from being UN ambassador for 4.5 years to becoming National Security Advisor, I was in New York on a Friday, in Washington in my office on a Monday, so it came quite suddenly, but it wasn't entirely unanticipated. And, you know, I had lived through some difficult times, difficult months, particularly the year before during the election campaign in the context of the fallout from the terrorist attack on our embassy or diplomatic facilities in Benghazi, and my going on the Sunday shows and being characterized afterwards as a liar and many other things. And so my mom had lived through all of that pain, and I think felt it very personally and profoundly. For her to see her daughter being maligned as somebody who lacked integrity or wasn't very bright, as one senator said, hurt her. And so I think for me to be coming back home, returning to Washington, rejoining my family who had stayed in Washington, being able to be there with her on a more sustained basis, and taking this new role that was one that I had long hoped I might one day be able to perform. I think she was quite pleased.
Okay, so now I want to get back to this amazing scholastic and academic career that you had to prepare for anything. Why foreign policy?
Well, let me back up. Born in 1964, you know, became conscious of the world around me because of my parents at a very early age. And in 1968, after Dr. King was assassinated, my parents took me down to see the Poor People's Campaign on the Washington Mall in the mud with my 2-year-old brother in a stroller. And they walked us down the 14th Street corridor, which had been burnt down following the riots after Dr. King's assassination. And my mom made me sit with her in front of the television set to see Robert Kennedy's casket come on that train from New York to Washington. And so I was raised in the moment, and my parents really wanted me and my little brother to understand that there was a larger world out there. And so Vietnam and Watergate and all of these things were formative experiences of my childhood. And I was very blessed to grow up in an environment and be able to go to schools that were some of the best schools in Washington. Thank you. And my classmates were the daughters and sons of members of Congress and ambassadors. And actually, some of my classmates' parents went to jail for Watergate. So all of these forces were very real influences. So I grew up in and around the business of government. My father served in government for many years. He was at the Treasury Department and the World Bank, and then ultimately was a governor of the Federal Reserve. And my mom didn't work in government, but her work was about education policy and making college accessible and affordable to low-income and minority Americans. And so I was raised in an environment where policy and the issues of the day were paramount. And so I knew from an early age that I cared about policymaking, that I wanted to be part of it. In fact, when I was about 10 years old, then by the time I reached my mid-20s, I realized I didn't have the patience and the temperament to beg people for money. And so I abandoned that. But I didn't abandon my interest in policy. And actually, the foreign policy thing came almost accidentally and belatedly. I really always thought that I was going to be a public interest lawyer, that I was going to fight for civil rights and social justice. And my plan had been to go to law school. And then I won the Rhodes Scholarship. And I had the opportunity to spend 2 or 3 years in Oxford, England, studying whatever I wanted. And I thought, okay, I've been focused on history and poli-sci and domestic issues. Let me use this 2 years to learn about something I don't know. And so I decided that I would study for my master's in international relations and do it overseas and have the benefit of an interesting and different perspective. And I got my master's, and as a story I relay in the book, I was persuaded to stay on and do my PhD in international relations. And literally one thing led to another. I had a series of forks in the road, academically and professionally. And at each fork, without a real plan or without a clear ambition, I chose the foreign policy path. And one thing led to another. And so I started in government, my first job at the White House at the National Security Council at age 28. And I had the portfolio that was responsible for the United Nations and peacekeeping. And then later, a more senior job working on Africa. And then later at the State Department as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. And so one thing just led to another. It wasn't the original plan.
Well, I'm going to ask you to read again, so I'm glad you have your glasses.
Okay. So the section I'm reading now, brief passage, is when I'm getting ready to leave Washington, D.C. and start my freshman year of college in California at Stanford. So it begins, just before I left for college, Dad took me to a quick dinner at McDonald's to give me some parting advice. To underscore his seriousness, after we started eating, he pulled out a couple small pages of handwritten notes. I didn't recall his prior lectures coming with crib notes, so I listened with extra attention. When he finished, I asked, "Dad, do you mind if I keep those notes?" "Sure," Dad grinned and handed me his scribbles, which I've preserved to this day. On this occasion, when I think Dad felt a special duty to send his firstborn off as well equipped as possible, his teachings were unusually pithy and wide-ranging. Dad's notes, just jots, condensed his advice into 5 numbered points. 1, use of time. Time is my most valuable asset. I must plan its use and manage it wisely. 2, work. I must have high standards for my work and learn to enjoy it, plan it, set goals. 3, trust. Trust is very tricky. There's no substitute for good judgment about people. I must know what I think at any given time, but be flexible and prepared to change my mind, to upgrade or downgrade my judgments, including of people, without waiting for a crisis or confrontation. He also insisted, in love, trust is an essential element. Be careful. 4, take care. I must take good care of my mind and body. Manage stress and care for my mental and physical hygiene. 5, philosophy. For my soul, I needed to formulate a comforting, persuasive, pervasive philosophy of life.
Wow. Now, I had great advice from my grandparents. They were not scholars. My grandfather had a 6th grade education, and my grandmother graduated from college but fell in love with a man with a 6th grade education and never worked again. But I wish I'd had your dad's notes. I wish I'd had those scribbles, because those are fantastic guides for life. So I want to talk a little bit now about that life and some of those choices and the first time you met Barack Obama. First of all, he's very handsome. And very charismatic. And so when you look past those things, I know that a lot of us saw that speech in 2004 and said that man is going to be president one day. But can you talk about the first time you met him, and then when you got the call to be a part of that campaign and not being a part of Hillary Clinton's campaign?
Well, I first spoke to Barack Obama on the telephone a few times before I actually met him in person. My first experience of him, like so many others, was watching him on the television during the 2004 Democratic Convention. At that point, I was working on John Kerry's presidential campaign. I'd recently joined his team as a senior foreign policy advisor. And I met Obama on the phone because at that time, as you'll recall, he was a state senator running for the United States Senate. And we had a very close mutual friend, a man named Tony Lake, who had been my first boss when he was National Security Advisor under President Clinton. And Tony Lake was providing advice to Obama in his campaign, and he thought it would be helpful for Obama and I to be synced up, so that if Obama wanted to adopt John Kerry's foreign policy positions or diverge from John Kerry's foreign policy positions, he was doing it, in an informed fashion. The first time I actually met him was later that summer in September at the Congressional Black Caucus Gala Dinner. And I was seated at a table with the Illinois delegation, and actually next to Reverend Jesse Jackson, with whom I'd worked during the Clinton administration when he was President Clinton's special envoy for democracy in Africa. And I was sitting on the, not sitting, but I guess kneeling on the floor. I was talking to Jackson and a few others, and I could sense this sort of movement and bustle from behind me. And I turned around and stood up and realized that it was State Senator Obama coming over to this table to greet the Illinois folks. And so I stood up, and we were immediately face to face, and I introduced myself, and he said, "I know who you are, and thank you so much for talking to me on the phone." Long story short, he becomes senator, and we get to know each other better. He calls me in for policy advice as he's serving on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and to help in the foreign policy chapter of his book, etc. And in early 2007, when he's decided to run for president, he asked me if I would co-lead, along with Tony Lake, the former national security advisor, his national security and foreign policy apparatus, and to help build a bench of experts who would be on his team and able to advise him. And so I said yes, even though I'd worked for 8 years during the Clinton administration and had proudly served President Bill Clinton and worked with then Senator Clinton when she was First Lady. And a few weeks after I had said yes to Senator Obama, I got a phone call from another former Clinton administration colleague, another former national security advisor and friend named Sandy Berger, who asked me if I would essentially perform the very same role for Senator Clinton as she ran for president. And I had to explain to Sandy that I had actually already committed to Barack Obama. And it was a phone call that I relay in the book where his reaction was sort of being stunned. How could I have made a decision to join Barack Obama's campaign rather than Hillary Clinton's? And didn't I understand that I was making a decision that was going to kill my career? Because, of course, I had to understand that Obama couldn't win. And by implication, although he was certainly not threatening me, he was a friend who remained a friend until he passed. He was warning me that, you know, having chosen Obama when Clinton ran and won, presumptively, that I would not be in good odor and would not be likely to have any career opportunities in a new Clinton administration. And I explained that yes, I understood the risks. Yes, I understood that that was in all likelihood the case. But I also explained that it wasn't a choice I was making against the Clintons, for whom I continued to have admiration and respect. I was making a choice in favor of Barack Obama, whose vision, whose experience, and whose persona felt so close to my own, and that was so important to me and my aspirations for what America can and should be. And that was the end of the conversation, which was a bit cold as it ended, but it all turned out okay. And not just because Obama won, but.
And you're such a great stateswoman, I don't know that I wouldn't have said, na 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 na.
No.
No, I'm teasing, I'm teasing.
No, you're not.
We have some questions from the audience that I'm trying to find it, that we're kind enough, oh, here they are. We're kind enough to send them in because we're not doing a live Q&A, but I do want to make sure that I get those questions in from some folks who did follow the instructions and send some. So Asia Browner, I'm going to ask your question. She's from Detroit, Michigan. And she said, what would you consider your biggest accomplishment in your roles as ambassador to the United Nations and national security advisor, both jobs?
Well, one thing that I hasten to say in answering this question is that these accomplishments are never mine personally or solely. They're things that I was proud to be able to work on and contribute to. And so when I look at the span of what we were able to achieve in national security and foreign policy, the things I'm most proud of are those things where the United States led with a vision and an objective, and we were able to bring other countries along to join us and make the outcome possible. And so things like the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, the effort to combat the Ebola epidemic and prevent it from becoming as much of a threat as it might have been. I think most people don't understand that when the epidemic hit, this is August and September of 2014, the head of the Centers for Disease Control, as I tell the story in the book, presented to the senior cabinet level national security team a chart that indicated that if nothing changed by December of 2014, up to 1 million people could be infected with the Ebola virus. And by the way, Ebola has a mortality rate of 50 to 75%. So the numbers dead would have been just extraordinary. And President Obama decided that that was not acceptable, even though we're talking about a disease that was mainly manifest in 3 countries in West Africa, and that he was going to rally the world to come together to try to contain and prevent that kind of spread. And President Obama decided to deploy 3,000 U.S. military personnel. Mm-hmm. Never before had we deployed the military to try to help stem a disease. Their role was not to treat people, but to provide the logistical support, the air bridge, the field hospitals for healthcare workers, to build the Ebola treatment centers that around the country would be able to enable infected people to get quality treatment. And then we brought together the French and the British and many, many other countries, and we were able to contain that extraordinary threat. As it turned out, about 28,000 people ended up being infected, and about 11,000 died. Still many, many, but far fewer than any worst case scenario. So those are examples. I mean, the opening to Cuba, there are many things that I feel proud that we were able to do and change the course of our foreign policy. Not surprisingly, a number of those things that I'm most proud of are precisely those things that the current administration has worked so hard to undo. But I do think that many of those achievements, with the probable exception of the Iran nuclear deal, are things that a new administration could conceivably recoup and move beyond even.
From your lips to God's ears. Our next question comes from Doreen Hunter of Detroit. How secure is our vote in 2020 with the threat that our vote is still compromised? And what can be done to turn this government around quickly, or at least bring it to a slow stop, with 45 being removed from office?
Vote! This is Michigan! This is Michigan! Detroit especially needs to vote. I'll tell a story. In 2016, I almost never traveled domestically with President Obama. I went, obviously, on all of his overseas trips. And once in a rare while, if there was some particular reason or we were doing something on a domestic trip, like a cybersecurity event or something like that that had a foreign policy aspect to it, or the UN General Assembly, then I'd travel with the president. But for the most part, domestically, I didn't. But his last domestic trip on the eve of the election in 2016, I really wanted to go on. I wanted to get out of the White House and into the rest of the country and get a sense of the feel, the mood. And our first stop was Michigan. And the first question I had is, why are we going to Michigan? But at that point, belatedly, it became obvious to the political folks that Michigan was at risk. We went from Michigan, this is all in one day, to New Hampshire, to Philadelphia. And I had all that day just an uncertain feeling. I can't say a sinking or queasy feeling, but the turnout here and in many other places relative to 2012 was way down. And we can't have that this time around if we genuinely want change. So, about the security of the ballot. I worry about more than just the mechanical, physical security of the ballot. And I write at some length in the book about how we dealt with the realization in 2016 that the Russians were interfering in our election, and how we came to know that and what we worked to do about it. But one of the things we were most worried about, maybe overly worried about in retrospect, was the risk that the Russians could manipulate either the vote count, which would be hard, but more potentially doable, manipulate the voter rolls so that people could be taken off the rolls or added to the rolls, or when they show up at the polls, they were somehow suddenly not registered. We were very focused on the mechanics of the vote, and we worked to try to convince the states to shore up their cybersecurity, their electoral system security. And they did a bit then, and they have done more since. And there has been some improvement throughout the 50 states. And in terms of the vote count, it's really important where we can to have a paper record. And many states have accomplished that, but not all. And it's also important to recognize that, thankfully, most of our voting systems, our counting systems, are not connected to the internet. They're self-contained state and local systems. So that makes them hard to hack into. The voter rolls we still need to worry about, but I think there's been considerable progress since 2016 in improving that. And there's legislation still sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. I wonder why it hasn't moved. That would substantially improve our investment in election security. But you know what worries me more, and this is what we didn't fully appreciate in 2016, more than the ability of the Russians and others, if they so choose, to manipulate the mechanics of the vote, which is a low probability risk. What they are doing every day as we speak is manipulating our perceptions of each other and our democracy. And I write in the book, in the last chapter called Bridging the Divide, that I strenuously believe that our domestic political divisions constitute our greatest national security vulnerability. And one of the key reasons I say that, there are more than one, but one of the key reasons is because an adversary like Russia has figured out that they can weaken us from within, cause us to turn on each other, cause us to doubt the very institutions of democracy, cause us to believe the worst about each other by manipulating the information we consume. And they are on social media every day of every week, fueling distrust and hatred from the right and the left. They don't have a policy agenda. They just want to pit Americans against each other. And so on issues of race or immigration or guns or gay rights or you name it, any issue that has polarized us, they're putting out the nastiest, most vitriolic messaging on both sides of the same debate to try to exacerbate our divisions. And so what I worry more about is that that Russian or adversarial efforts could cause people to not want to come to the polls, or cause people to believe that the vote's going to be rigged and therefore there's no point in coming, or to question the outcome, whatever it may be. And so as citizens, we not only have to register and vote and come out and organize our communities to participate, but we also have to be much more careful and educated consumers of the information we receive, and to recognize that there is this effort to do just that, to pit us against each other and cause us to question our very institutions and our system of democracy. And we have to be smarter than that, and we can't let them succeed in turning us against each other, or the Russians can weaken and even defeat us without ever firing a single shot.
There you go. Thank you. We now have a question from my sorority sister, Edith Friley of Detroit. Who do you feel will be the best candidate to unseat Donald Trump?
Well, I have not, in this cycle, yet endorsed anybody. And a variety of reasons for that, but mostly that I am, first of all, of the view that we've had a strong field and a number of candidates that I view favorably. Some of them, sadly, have dropped out. But I think the kind of leader we need, and I'm not making an endorsement here today, is somebody with a clear policy vision, who understands the complexities of governing, who can appeal not only to Democrats of all stripes, but can reach into the middle and to independents and to disaffected Republicans. I think we need somebody with the ability to appeal broadly, because I don't think we can win, frankly, purely by playing to any, any ideal extreme. And so that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the candidate who can unite not just the Democratic Party, but a broader spectrum beyond the Democratic Party, independents and those Republicans who don't want to vote for Donald Trump, but are going to struggle to vote for a Democrat and want to feel that the Democrat that they can vote for is one that, can be a unifying and inclusive figure.
Well, Edith didn't ask me, but
what's your answer?
For the longest time, I thought it would be the candidate who picked Julian Castro for vice president, whichever person that was. But he has now aligned himself with Elizabeth Warren very deliberately, and I don't know what that might look like. So I don't know. I'm still waiting for it to get down to 3 candidates before I even engage. I think that we waited too long to spend time getting one person ready to go against Donald Trump. We're still playing by the old rules and doing business as usual when the world is on fire. So I wish we'd move a little faster.
It'll be all right. Just as long as people are engaged.
And vote.
And participate and register and vote and get their people out. All right.
Okay.
I'm going to get back on that soapbox.
I know. So the last question comes from Glenda Cornelius, also of Detroit. And before I ask the question, I'll make my final comment, which is there are people who are raised for greatness, and you are one of those. Many of us who were taught all of American history understand W.E.B. Du Bois's theory about the talented tenth and who those folks were, and you're a part of that. So Glenda's question, Miss Glenda asked, do you plan to run for public office? Or would you work for another Democratic administration? This book brings us to the present and where you are now, and everybody make sure you get tough love. But a lot of people, because of all you've accomplished, want to know what's next. You gonna run for something? That's not a no.
Now, you're making this really hard because my daughter's in the front row. And she's threatened that if I ever run for anything, she'll kill me. So I'm going to make you own that right here. The short answer is I don't know. I remain open to serving if I think I can be effective, if I think I can make a difference. Whether that's returning to an appointed office or running for some kind of elective office. I haven't ruled that out. But I also, to be very honest, haven't determined that that's what I necessarily want to do. We started the conversation with my being excited to have my freedom. And quite honestly, that freedom has been an extraordinary gift. The freedom to reflect, to have some perspective, to spend quality time with my children and my family and friends. I don't do anything I don't want to do anymore.
All right.
Which is right. And I get a bad attitude when I have to get dressed up, because most days I'm in, this is dressed up. Most days I'm in yoga pants and a fleece. And that's what I'm talking about. I love that. And there's a whole world out there in the nonprofit world, in academia, in the private sector, that are all worthy ways of contributing and serving. So I have not ruled anything out or anything in.
I think that's fair.
I do want to say, because you mentioned this in the outset, and I just want to, if you all give me a couple minutes, I want to tell you a little bit about my parents.
Yes.
And about my upbringing. I don't know about talented 10, but I do know that I was blessed to have parents that gave me an extraordinary boost. My mother was the youngest of 5 children. Her parents came from Jamaica to Portland, Maine in 1912. And you can imagine Portland, Maine in 1912. There weren't a lot of folks that looked like us. And my grandparents had no formal education. My grandfather was a janitor. My grandmother was a maid and a seamstress. And they, like so many immigrants, came to this country with the dream of giving their children more opportunity than they had. And they saved and they scraped and they lived a modest but proud life. And they were able to send all 5 of their kids to college. And 2 of my uncles became doctors. Both of them practiced here in Detroit. My uncle Leon Dixon lived here for 60 years, raised his family here, my cousins, and was a family practitioner, along with my youngest uncle Freddie, who died very early. My other uncles, one became an optometrist, one became a university president. And then along came my mother, the baby, who was able to, through a long series of good events and good fortune, she was a valedictorian of her high school class in Portland, Maine. She was a champion debater and president of her school government, and she went on to Radcliffe College, now part of Harvard. And she gave her career, for the most part, to establishing the Pell Grant program, which has enabled 80 million Americans to go to college. Because she knew how fortunate she was to have gotten the scholarship money that enabled her to go to college, and how much of a difference that made. So that was my mother. She did many other things. She went on to be a corporate executive and serve on 11 corporate boards and a bunch of other things. But her big thing was access to higher education. And my dad, the one with the good advice,
Yes.
They both had good advice, but he was born and raised in segregated South Carolina in 1920. And his story was amazing too, because he was 3rd generation college educated. His grandfather was born a slave in South Carolina, fought in the Union Army after emancipation, and because of a white officer who had been one of his commanders, he was able to come up to Massachusetts after the war and begin to get a primary education. He got his primary education. This is my great-grandfather, Walter Rice. He went back to South Carolina, became a teacher, and then got driven out of South Carolina by the Klan. And he moved north to New Jersey, got his divinity degree at Lincoln University, and then became both a minister and a teacher. And he founded a school in New Jersey called the Bordentown School. which for 70 years, from the late 1880s when he started it, to 1955, right after the Brown decision, when it had to be disbanded. I'll come back to that. This school, the Bordentown School, educated generations of African Americans, not only in manual and technical skills like a Tuskegee, but also in college preparatory skills. And this school brought Albert Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune to campus. It was an extraordinary institution. It had to disband because it was a state-supported school and it was segregated. And that was no longer allowed after Brown. How ironic. Anyway, along comes my dad, and he had the weight of expectation on him. His dad had been a minister and also gone to Lincoln University. But my dad's father died when my dad was just 7. And eventually he and his family moved to New York City. And my dad got his undergraduate degree and his MBA at City College of New York. And then he was drafted into World War II. And he served at Tuskegee with the Tuskegee Airmen. And that experience for him was just profoundly formative. He resented mightily the notion that African Americans serving in a segregated military had to prove to white people that they could fly or fight as well as anybody. He thought that was absurd. And he thought that it was incredibly demeaning to be asked to fight on behalf of your country, on behalf of a war for freedom, for everybody except his own people. And as proud as he was of his country and to serve, this burden of bigotry and racism weighed heavily on him. He would go off the base and see German prisoners of war being served in restaurants that refused to serve him. And so his whole experience and the sort of the origins of his life lessons, which he taught me and my brother over so many years, were in many ways lessons of how to overcome prejudice and bigotry and to succeed despite them. After the war, he went to California, to the University of California at Berkeley, and he got his PhD in economics. And then he became a professor at Cornell, and then became an esteemed economist, and as I mentioned, ended up on the Federal Reserve. But these were parents that, from very different stories, the immigrant and the descendant of slaves figured out in their own way how to compete and to thrive in a world that arguably didn't want or expect them to thrive. And they tried to teach me and my brother the same, to believe in ourselves, to not let anybody define us for us. My dad used to say, if my being black is going to be a problem, it's going to be a problem for somebody else, not for me.
That's right.
And by that he meant that he understood at some stage, and probably not until his early professional career, that bigotry was to a large extent a function of the bigot's own insecurity. And as somebody who was going to face racism and all kinds of barriers, which he may not be able to control, what he could control, he realized, was whether or not he let the bigot's definition of himself become his own.
That's right.
And he decided through, really extended years of mental gymnastics and developing those mental muscles of self-esteem, that he was not going to let other people tell him he couldn't. And he was not going to take crap off of anybody, which was his
That's right.
repeated mantra to us. And so he, which I took to heart, for better or for worse. But anyway, he taught us to believe in ourselves and to not let others define us for us.
I think that's probably the best lesson of all. And no offense to Maris. I've only told one other person in the world, and I won't say who it was, that if they ever decided to run for office, I'd stop what I was doing and help them. But if you ever decide to run for office, I will stop what I'm doing
Oh my goodness.
to help you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Susan Rice.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate this.
Thank you. Very great.